Right, Chapter 3. During the second half of June and the whole of July in 1963, France was rocked by an outbreak of violent crime against banks, jewelers' shops, and post offices that was unprecedented at the time and has never been repeated since. The details of the crime wave are now a matter of record. Oh, this did happen actually. That uh, or at least there was a wave of crime during the period. It's convenient. From one end of the country to the other, banks were held up with pistols, sawed-off shotguns, and submachine guns on an almost daily basis. Smash and grab raids at jewelers' shops became so common throughout that period that local police forces had hardly finished taking depositions from the shaken and often bleeding jewelers and their assistants before they were called away to another similar case within their own district. Two bank clerks were shot in different towns as they tried to resist the robbers, and before the end of July the crisis had grown so great that the men of the Corps Républicain de Sécurité, the anti-riot squads known to every Frenchman simply as the CRS, I wonder why, um, were called in and for the first time armed with submachine guns. It became habitual for those entering a bank to pass one or two of the blue uniformed CRS guards in the foyer, each toting a loaded submachine gun, loaded submachine carbine. In response to pressure from the bankers and jewelers, who complained bitterly to the government about this crime wave, police checks on banks at night were increased in frequency, but to no avail, since the robbers were not professional cracksmen able to open bank vaults skillfully during the hours of darkness, but simply thugs in masks armed and ready to shoot if provoked in the slightest way. The danger hours were in daylight, when any bank or jeweler's shop throughout the country could be surprised in the middle of business by the appearance of two or three armed and masked men in the peremptory cry, "Out les mains! Out! Haut les mains! Haut les mains!" Man, French people. I guess that's hands up. This is a stick up. This is a stick up. Anyway, three robbers were wounded towards the end of July in different holdups and taken prisoner. Each turned out to be either a petty crook known to be using the existence of the OAS as an excuse for general anarchy, or a deserter from one of the former colonial regiments, who soon admitted that he was an OAS man. But despite the most diligent interrogations at police headquarters, none of the three could be persuaded to say why this rash of robberies had suddenly struck the country, other than that they had been contacted by their patron, gang boss, and given a target in the form of a bank or jewel shop. Eventually, the police came to believe that the prisoners did not know what the purpose of the robberies was. They had each been promised a cut of the total, and being small fry, had done what they were told. It did not take the French authorities long to realize that the OAS was behind the outbreak and that for some reason the OAS needed money in a hurry. But it was not until the first fortnight of August, and then in a quite different manner that the authorities discovered why. Within the last 2 weeks of June, a wave of crime against banks and other places where money or gems could be quickly and unceremoniously acquired had become sufficiently serious to be handed over to the commissaire Maurice Bouvier, the much revered chief of the Brigade Criminale of the Police Judiciaire, in his surprisingly small, work strewn office at the headquarters of the PJ at 36 Why de Orfèvres along the banks of the Seine. A chart was prepared showing the cash, or in the case of jewelry, approximate resale value of the stolen money or gems. By the latter half of July, the total was well over 2 million new francs, or $400,000. Even with a reasonable sum deducted for the expenses of mounting various robberies, and for more paying the hoodlums and deserters who carried them out, that still left, in the commissaire's estimation, a sizable money that could not be accounted for. In the last week of June, a report landed on the desk of General Gibaud, the head of the SDECE, from the chief of his permanent office in Rome. It was to the effect that the three top men of the OAS, Marc Rodin, René Montclar, and André Casson, had taken up residence together on the top floor of a hotel just off the Via Condotti. The report added that despite the obvious cost of residing in such an exclusive quarter, the three had taken the entire top floor for themselves, and the floor below for their bodyguards. They were being guarded at night and by day by no less than 8 extremely tough ex-members of the Foreign Legion, and were not venturing out at all. At first it was thought they had met for a conference, but as the days passed, SDECE came to the view that they were simply taking exceptionally heavy precautions to ensure that they were not the victims of another kidnapping as had been inflicted on Antoine Argaud. General Gibaud permitted himself a grim smile at the sight of the top men of the terrorist organization themselves now cowering in a hotel in Rome, and filed the report in a routine manner. Despite the bitter row still festering between the French Foreign Ministry at the Quai d'Orsay and the German Foreign Ministry in Bonn over the infringement of German territorial integrity at the Eden Wolf Hotel the previous February, Gibaud had every reason to be pleased with his action servicemen who had carried out the coup. The sight of the OAS chiefs running scared was reward enough in itself. The general smothered a small shadow of misgivings as he surveyed the file of Marc Rodin, and nevertheless asked himself why a man like Rodin should scare that easily. As a man with considerable experience in his own job and an awareness of the realities of politics and diplomacy, he knew he would most likely he knew he would be most likely un all right, Fred. He knew he would be most unlikely ever to obtain permission to organize another snatch job. It was only much later that the real significance of the precautions the three OAS men were taking for their own safety became clear to him. Okay, here what this about body kidnappings and bodyguards. We're like, wait, aren't as modern Americans that live in the post 9/11 climate, we're like, wait, what? These guys are part of a known terrorist organization. Why do you mean why are we calling arresting this guy a kidnapping? Well, see, this is back then, and this is before 9/11, way before 9/11, and also it's France, so they probably have to like have proof to get a warrant, and then and they can't let it be known as to why they want this warrant. See, it's all there's a cat and mouse game here that they had to play. Um, they technically did kidnap Argaud, I guess. Anyway, In London, the Jackal spent the last fortnight of June and the first 2 weeks of July in carefully controlled and planned activity. From the day of his return he set himself among other things to acquire and read almost every word written about or by Charles de Gaulle. By the simple expedient of going to the local lending library and looking up the most recent books on de Gaulle, he compiled a comprehensive bibliography about his subject. After that, he wrote off to various well-known bookshops, using a false name and a forwarding address in Prod Street, Paddington, and required the necessary books by post. These he scoured until the small hours of each morning in his flat, building up in his mind a most detailed picture of the incumbent of the Elysee Palace, from his boyhood until the time of reading. Much of the information he gleaned was of no practical use, but here and there a quirk or character trait would emerge that he noted in a small exercise book. Most instructive concerning that the character of the French president was the third volume of the general's memoirs, The Edge of the Sword, Le Fil de l'Épée in French, in which Charles de Gaulle was at his most illuminating about his own personal attitude to life, his country, and his destiny as he saw it. The Jackal was neither a slow nor a stupid man. He read voraciously and planned meticulously, and possessed the faculty to store in his mind an enormous amount of factual information on the off chance that he might later have a use for it. But although his reading of the works of Charles de Gaulle, and the books about him by the men who knew him best, provided a full picture of the proud and disdainful President of France, it still did not solve the main question that had been baffling him, since he accepted the assignment in Rodin's bedroom in Vienna on June 15th. By the end of the first week in July he had still not worked out the answer to his question: when, where, and how should the hit take place? As a last resort, he went down to the reading room of the British Museum and, after signing his application for permission to do research with his habitual false name, started to work his way through the back copies of France's leading daily newspaper, Le Figaro. Just when the answer came to him is not exactly known, but it is fair to presume it was within 3 days from July 7. Within those 3 days, starting with the germ of an idea triggered by a columnist writing in 1962, cross-checking back through the files covering every year of de Gaulle's presidency since 1945, the assassin managed to answer his own question. He decided within that time precisely on what day, come illness or bad weather, totally regardless of any considerations of personal danger, Charles de Gaulle would stand up publicly and show himself. From that point from that point on, the Jackal's preparations moved out of the research stage and into that of practical planning. It took long hours of thought, lying on his back in his flat, staring up at the cream-painted ceiling, and chain-smoking his habitual king-size filter cigarettes, before the last detail had clicked into place. At least a dozen ideas were considered and rejected before he finally hit on the plan he decided to adopt. The how that had decided to be added to the when and where that he had already decided. The Jackal was perfectly aware that in 1963 General de Gaulle was not only the President of France, he was also the most closely and skillfully guarded figure in the Western world. To assassinate him, as was later proved, was considerably more difficult than to kill President John F. Kennedy of the United States. Although the English killer did not know it, French security experts who had through American courtesy been given an opportunity to study the precautions taken to guard the life of President Kennedy had returned somewhat disdainful of those precautions as exercised by the American Secret Service. The French experts' rejection of the American methods was later justified when in November 1963 John Kennedy was killed in Dallas by a half-crazed amateur while Charles de Gaulle lived on, to retire in peace and eventually to die in his own house. What the Jackal did know was that the security men he was up against were at least among the best in the world, that the whole security apparatus around de Gaulle was in a state of permanent forewarning of the likelihood of some attempt being made on their charge's life, and that the organization for which he worked was riddled with security leaks. On the credit side, he could reasonably bank on his own anonymity and on the choleric refusal of his victim to cooperate with his own security forces. On the chosen day, the pride, the stubbornness, and the absolute contempt for personal danger of the French president would force him to come out into the open for a few seconds, no matter what the risks involved. The SAS airliner from Kastrup, Copenhagen, made one last swing into line in front of the terminal building at London, trundled forward a few feet, and halted. The engines whined on for a few seconds, then they also died away. Within a few minutes the steps were wheeled up, and the passengers started to file out and down, nodding a last good-bye to the smiling stewardess at the top. On the observation terrace the blond man slipped his dark glasses upward onto his forehead and applied his eyes to a pair of binoculars. The file of passengers coming down the steps was the sixth that morning to be subjected to this kind of scrutiny. But as the terrace was crowded in the warm sunshine with people waiting for arriving passengers and trying to spot them as soon as they emerged from their aircraft, the watcher's behavior aroused no interest. As the eighth passenger emerged into the light and straightened up, the man on the terrace tensed slightly and followed the new arrival down the steps. The passenger from Denmark was a priest or a pastor, in a clerical gray suit with a dog collar. He appeared to be in his late 40s from the iron gray haircut at medium length that was brushed back from the forehead. But the face was more youthful. He was a tall man with wide shoulders, and he looked physically fit. He had approximately the same build as the man who watched him from the terrace above. As the passengers filed into the arrivals lounge for passport and customs clearance, the Jackal dropped the binoculars into the leather briefcase by his side, closed it, and walked quietly back through the glass doors and down into the main hall. 15 minutes later the Danish pastor emerged from the customs hall holding a grip and a suitcase. There appeared to be nobody to meet him, and his first call was made to the Barclays bank counter to change money. From what he told the Danish police when they interrogated him 6 weeks later, he did not notice the blond young Englishman standing beside him at the counter, apparently waiting his turn in the queue, but quietly examining the features of the Dane from behind dark glasses. At least he had no memory of such a man. But when he came out of the main hall to board the BEA coach to the Cromwell Road terminal, the Englishman was a few paces behind him, holding his briefcase, and they must have traveled into London on the same coach. At the terminal, the Dane had to wait a few minutes while his suitcase was unloaded from the luggage trailer behind the coach, then wend his way past the checking-in counters to the exit signs marked with an arrow and the international word, "Taxis." While he did so, the Jackal strode round the back of the coach and across the floor of the coach park to where he had left his car in the staff car park. He hefted the briefcase into the passenger seat of the open sports model, climbed in, and started up, bringing the car to a halt close to the left-hand wall of the terminal from where he could glance to the right down the long line of waiting taxis under the pillared arcade. The Dane climbed into the third taxi, which cruised off into the Cromwell Road, heading toward Knightsbridge. The sports car followed. The taxi dropped the oblivious priest at a small but comfortable hotel in Half Moon Street, while the sports car shot past the entrance and within a few minutes had found a spare parking meter on the far side of Curzon Street. The jackal locked the briefcase in the trunk, bought a midday edition of the Evening Standard at the newsagent in Shepherd Market, and was back in the foyer of the hotel within 5 minutes. He had to wait another 25 before the Dane came downstairs and handed back his room key to the receptionist. After she hung it up, the key swayed for a few seconds from the hook, and the man in one of the foyer armchairs, apparently waiting for a friend, who lowered his newspaper as the Dane passed into the restaurant, noted that the number of the key was 47. A few minutes later, as the receptionist bobbed back into the rear office to check a theater booking for one of the guests, the man in the dark glasses slipped quietly and unnoticed up the stairs. A 2-inch wide strip of flexible mica was not enough to open the door of room 47, which was rather stiff, but the mica strip, stiffened by a whippy little artist's palette knife, did the trick, and the spring lock slipped back with a click. As he had only gone downstairs for lunch, the pastor had left his passport on the bedside table. The jackal was back in the corridor within 30 seconds, leaving the folder of traveler's checks untouched in the hopes that without any evidence of a theft, the authorities would try to persuade the Dane that he had simply lost his passport somewhere else. And so it proved. Long before the Dane had finished his coffee, the Englishman had departed unseen, and it was not until much later in the afternoon, after a thorough and mystified search of his room, that the pastor mentioned the disappearance of his passport to the manager. The manager also searched the room, and after pointing out that everything else, including the wallet of traveler's checks, was intact, brought all his advocacy to bear to persuade his bewildered guest that there was no need to bring the police to his hotel, since he had evidently lost his passport somewhere in transit. The Dane, being a kindly man and not too sure of his ground in a foreign country, agreed despite himself that this was what must have happened. So he reported the loss to the Danish consulate general the next day, and was issued with travel documents with which to return to Copenhagen at the end of his fortnight's stay in London, and thought no more about it. The clerk at the consulate general who issued the travel documents filed the loss of a passport in the name of Pastor Per Jensen, or Per Jensen. It's Jensen, this is Danish. Pastor Per Jensen of Stant Kjeldskirke in Copenhagen, and thought no more about it either. The date was July 1914. 2 days later, a loss was experienced by an American student from Syracuse, New York. He had arrived at the Oceanic Building of London Airport from New York, and he produced his passport in order to change the first of his traveler's checks at the American Express counter. After changing the check, he placed the money in an inside pocket of his jacket, and the passport inside a zipped pouch, which he stuffed back into a small leather hand grip. A few minutes later, trying to attract the attention of a porter, he put the grip down for a moment, and 3 seconds later it was gone. At first he remonstrated with the porter, who led him to the Pan American Inquiries desks, which directed him to the attention of the nearest terminal security police officer. The latter took him to an office where he explained his dilemma. After a search had ruled out the possibility that the grip might have been taken by someone else accidentally in mistake for his own, a report was filed listing the matter as a deliberate theft. Apologies were made and regrets were expressed to the tall and athletic young American about the activities of pickpockets and bag snatchers in public places. And he was told of the many precautions the airport authorities took to try to curb their thefts from incoming foreigners. He had the grace to admit that a friend of his was once robbed in a similar manner in Grand Central Station. The report was eventually circulated in a routine manner to all the divisions of the London Metropolitan Office, together with a description of the missing grip, its contents, and the papers and passport in the pouch. This was duly filed, but as weeks passed and no trace was found of either the grip or its contents, no more was thought of the incident. Meanwhile, Marty Schulberg went to his consulate in Grosvenor Square, reported the theft of his passport, and was issued with travel documents enabling him to fly back to the United States after his month's vacation touring the Highlands of Scotland with his exchange student girlfriend. At the consulate, the loss was registered, reported to State Department in Washington, and duly forgotten by both establishments. It will never be known just how many incoming passengers at London airport's two overseas arrivals passenger buildings were scanned through binoculars from the observation terraces as they emerged from their aircraft and headed down the steps. Despite the difference in their ages, the two who lost their passports had some things in common. Both were around 6 feet tall, had broad shoulders and slim figures, blue eyes, and a fairly close facial resemblance to the unobtrusive Englishman who had followed and robbed them. Otherwise, Pastor Jensen was aged 48, with gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses for reading. Marty Schulberg was 25, with chestnut brown hair and heavy-rimmed executive glasses which he wore all the time. These were the faces the Jackal studied at length on the writing bureau in his flat off South Audley Street. It took him one day and a series of visits to theatrical costumiers, opticians, a man's clothing store in the West End specializing in garments of American type, and mainly made in New York, to acquire a set of blue-tinted, clear-vision contact lenses, two pairs of spectacles, one with gold rims and the other with heavy black frames, and both with clear lenses. A complete outfit consisting of a pair of black leather loafers, t-shirt and underpants, off-white slacks, and a sky-blue nylon windbreaker with a zip-up front and collars and cuffs in red and white wool, all made in New York, and a clergyman's white shirt, starched dog collar, and black bib. From each of the last three the maker's label was carefully removed. His last visit of the day was to a men's wig and toupee emporium in Chelsea run by two homosexuals. Here he acquired a preparation for tinting the hair a medium gray and another for tinting it chestnut brown, along with precise and coyly delivered instructions on how to apply the tint to achieve the best and most natural-looking effect in the shortest time. He also bought several small hairbrushes for applying the liquids. Otherwise, apart from the complete set of American clothes, he did not make more than one purchase at any one shop. The following day, July 18, there was a small paragraph at the bottom of an inside page of Le Figaro. It announced that in Paris, the deputy chief of the Brigade Criminelle of the Police Judiciaire, Commissaire Hippolyte Dupuis, had suffered a severe stroke in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres and had died on his way to hospital. A successor had been named. He was Commissaire Claude Lebel, chief of the homicide division, and in view of the pressure of work on all the departments of the brigade during the summer months, he would take up his new duties forthwith. The Jackal, who read every French newspaper available in London each day, read the paragraph after his eyes had been caught by the word "criminel" in the headline, but thought nothing of it. Before starting his daily watch at London Airport, he had decided to operate throughout the whole of the forthcoming assassination under a false identity. It is one of the easiest things in the world to acquire a false British passport. The Jackal followed the procedure used by most mercenaries, smugglers, and others who wished to adopt an alias for passing national boundaries. First, he took a car trip through the counties of the Thames Valley looking for small villages. Almost every English village has an attractive little church, and a graveyard nestling in its shadow. In the third similar in the third cemetery he visited, the Jackal found a gravestone to suit his purpose, that of Alexander Duggan, who died at the age of 2.5 years in 1931. Had he lived, the Duggan child would have been a few months older than the Jackal in July 1963. The elderly vicar was courageous and helpful when the visitor presented himself at the vicarage to announce that he was an amateur genealogist engaged in attempting to trace the family tree of the Duggans. He had been informed that there had been a Duggan family that had settled in the village in years past. He wondered, somewhat diffidently, if the parish records might be able to help him in his search. The vicar was kindness itself, and on their way over to the church, a compliment on the beauty of the little Norman building and a contribution to the donations box for the restoration fund improved the atmosphere yet more. The records showed that both the Duggan parents had died over the past 7 years, and alas, their only son Alexander had been buried in this very churchyard over 30 years before. The Jackal idly turned over the pages in the parish register of births, marriages, and deaths for 1929, and for the month of April the name of Duggan, written in a crabbed and clerky hand, caught his eye. Alexander James Quentin Duggan, born April 3rd, 1929, in the parish of St. Mark's, Samborne, Fishley. He noted the details, thanked the vicar profusely, and left. Back in London, he presented himself at the Central Registry of Births, Marriages, and Deaths, where a helpful young assistant accepted without query his visiting card showing him to be a partner in a firm of solicitors of Market Drayton, Shropshire, and his explanation that he was engaged in trying to trace the whereabouts of the grandchildren of one of his firm's clients who had recently died and left her estate to her grandchildren. One of these grandchildren was Alexander James Quentin Duggan, born at Samborne Fishley in the parish of St. Mark's on April 3rd, 1929. Most civil servants in Britain do their best to be helpful when confronted by polite inquiry, and in this case the assistant was no exception. A search of the records showed that the child in question had been registered precisely according to the inquirer's information, but had died on November 8th, 1931, as the result of a road accident. For a few shillings, the Jackal received a copy of both the birth and death certificates. Before returning home, he stopped at a branch office of the Ministry of Labor and was issued with a passport application form. At a toy shop where for 15 shillings he bought a child's printing set, and at a post office for a £1 postal order. Back in his flat, he filled in the application form in Duggan's name, giving exactly the right age, date of birth, etc., but his own personal description. He wrote in his own height, color of hair and eyes, and profession, put down simply businessman. The full names of Duggan's parents, taken from the child's birth certificate, were also filled in. For the reference, he filled in the name of Reverend James Elderly, vicar of St. Mark's, Samborne Fishley, to whom he had spoken that morning, and whose full name and title of LL.D. had obligingly been printed on a board outside the church gate. The vicar's signature was forged in a thin hand in thin ink with a thin nib, and from the printing set he made up a stamp reading, St. Mark's Parish Church, Samborne Fishley, which was placed firmly next to the vicar's name. The copy of the birth certificate, the application form, and the postal order were sent off to the passport office in Petty, France. The death certificate he destroyed. The brand new passport arrived at the accommodation address by post 4 days later, as he was reading that morning's edition of Le Figaro. He picked it up after lunch. Late that afternoon he locked the flat and drove to London Airport, where he boarded the flight to Copenhagen, paying in cash again to avoid using a checkbook. In the false bottom of his briefcase, in a compartment barely thicker than an ordinary magazine, and almost undetectable except to the most thorough search, was £2,000, which he had drawn earlier that day from his private deed box in the vaults of a firm of solicitors in Holborn. The visit to Copenhagen was brisk and businesslike. Before leaving Kastrup Airport, he booked himself on the next afternoon's flight. He booked himself on the next afternoon's Sabina flight to Brussels. In the Danish capital, it was far too late to go shopping, so he booked in at the Hotel d'Angleterre on Kongens Nytorv, ate like a king at the Seven Nations, had a mild flirtation with two Danish blondes while strolling through the Tivoli gardens, and was in bed by 1 in the morning. The next day he bought a lightweight clerical grey suit at one of the best-known men's outfitters in central Copenhagen, a pair of sober black walking shoes, a pair of socks, a set of underwear, and 3 white shirts with collars attached. In each case he bought only what had the Danish maker's name on a small cloth tab inside. In the case of the 3 white shirts, which he did not need, the point of the purchase was simply to acquire the tabs for transference to the clerical shirt, dog collar, and bib that he had bought in London while claiming to be a theological student on the verge of ordination. His last purchase was a book in Danish on the notable churches and cathedrals of France. He lunched off of a large, cold collation at a lakeside restaurant in the Tivoli Gardens and caught the 3:15 plane to Brussels. I guess a cold collation? I have no idea what that is. A cold collation. Maybe that's like charcuterie board or something. Caught the 3:15 plane to Brussels. All right, guys. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm trying to get my legs on this. Stop stumbling there. My head gets I get ahead of myself there sometimes. Thank you though.